The sun was setting over the small, quiet town of Maplewood, casting long shadows across the streets. The air carried a faint chill, signaling the arrival of autumn. At Joe's Diner, a cozy little restaurant tucked away on the corner of Main Street, life moved at its usual slow pace. The diner was known for its hearty meals, friendly staff, and the comforting aroma of fried food that wafted out every time someone opened the door. Inside, the atmosphere was calm. A few locals sat scattered around the room, chatting quietly, or sipping coffee while they read newspapers. The jukebox in the corner played a soft country tune, barely audible over the gentle hum of conversation. Lila Harper, a young waitress with curly brown hair tied back in a ponytail, moved between tables with practiced ease. She balanced plates of food on one arm and kept her notepad tucked neatly into the pocket of her apron. Lila had been working at Joe's Diner for 2 years now. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and more importantly, it gave her flexibility to attend night classes at the community college. Her dream was to become a nurse, and she worked tirelessly toward that goal. Despite the long hours and occasional rude customer, Lila always greeted people with a warm smile. She believed kindness could make even the toughest days a little brighter. But tonight things were about to change. The sound of roaring engines broke through the peaceful evening. Outside, a group of bikers pulled into the parking lot, their motorcycles gleaming under the flickering neon sign that read Joe's Diner. The leader of the pack parked his bike right in front of the entrance, revving the engine one last time before cutting it off. He swung his leg over the seat and removed his helmet, revealing a face marked by years of hard living. His name was Jake Malone, though everyone called him Jaws because of the jagged scar running along his jawline. Tattoos covered his muscular arms, and his leather jacket bore patches from various biker clubs he claimed allegiance to. Jake led his gang inside, their heavy boots thudding against the tiled floor. They took up residence in a large booth near the window, laughing loudly and drawing stares from the other patrons. Their presence instantly shifted the mood of the diner. Conversations grew quieter, and some customers exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew who these men were, troublemakers who thought rules didn't apply to them. Lila approached their table cautiously, forcing herself to smile despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Hi there," she said brightly, holding her notepad ready. "Can I get you guys started with something to drink?" Jake leaned back in his seat, his sharp eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Yeah, we'll take 6 beers," he replied gruffly. "And don't keep us waiting." "Sure thing," Lila responded, jotting down the order. As she turned to leave, one of the bikers reached out and grabbed her wrist. Startled, she froze. "Hey, sweetheart," the man sneered. "How about you give me your number instead? Maybe we can grab dinner after your shift." Lila gently pulled her hand free, her cheeks flushing red. "I'm just here to take your order," she said firmly but politely. Without another word, she hurried toward the counter to fetch the drinks. Behind the scenes, the kitchen buzzed with activity. Joe himself, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual scowl, was flipping burgers on the grill. When Lila handed him the ticket, he glanced toward the biker's table and frowned. "Be careful with those guys," he muttered. "They're bad news." "I know," Lila whispered back, trying to mask her unease. She loaded the beers onto a tray and carefully carried them back to the table. But as fate would have it, disaster struck. Just as she set the tray down, Jake suddenly leaned forward, knocking it sideways. Bottles clattered to the floor, spilling. Beer everywhere, including onto Jake's prized leather jacket. For a moment, silence fell over the diner. Then Jake erupted. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he roared. Standing up so fast his chair toppled backward. His voice echoed off the walls, making several customers jump. "Look what you did to my jacket," Lila stammered, her face pale. I'm sorry. It was an accident." "An accident," Jake repeated, his tone dripping with venom. He grabbed her wrist tightly, yanking her closer. "You think ruining my stuff is just an accident? You better start apologizing real nice, or I'll make sure you regret this." Tears welled up in Lila's eyes as she struggled to pull away. The pain in her wrist was sharp, but worse than that was the humiliation burning in her chest. She hated feeling powerless, especially in front of so many people. Yet no one dared step in, not even Joe, who watched helplessly from behind the counter. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, a deep voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." All heads turned toward the source of the interruption. Sitting at the counter unnoticed until now was a man in his late 50s. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, his weathered face framed by short gray hair. There was nothing particularly remarkable about his appearance except for the commanding aura he exuded. This was Chuck Norris, retired martial artist and Hollywood icon, though no one in the diner recognized him. Chuck stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He walked over to Jake and Lila, stopping only when he was close enough to look the biker directly in the eye. "Let her go," he said evenly. Jake scoffed, tightening his grip on Lila's wrist. "Who the hell are you supposed to be, old man?" "My name's Chuck," came the reply. His voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was steel beneath it. "And trust me, you don't want to find out." Despite his bravado, Jake hesitated. Something about Chuck's demeanor unnerved him. Still, pride got the better of him, and he decided to call the stranger's bluff. With a sneer, he shoved Lila aside and stepped forward. "Listen, Grandpa." Before he could finish his sentence, Chuck acted. In one fluid motion, he twisted Jake's arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees. The entire diner gasped in unison. No one could believe what they were seeing. "You've made your point," Chuck said quietly, releasing Jake but keeping him pinned in place. "Now leave the girl alone." Jake scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. For a moment it looked like he might retaliate, but then he caught the look in Chuck's eyes. It was a look that said, "I've seen worse than you." Slowly, Jake backed down. Without another word, Chuck turned to Lila, who was still trembling. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, too stunned to speak. "Good," Chuck said, offering her a reassuring smile. Then, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, he returned to his seat at the counter and resumed drinking his coffee. The diner remained eerily silent for several minutes afterward. The bikers quickly paid their bill and left, muttering curses under their breath. Meanwhile, Lila stood frozen in place, replaying the scene in her mind. She didn't know who Chuck was or why he'd intervened, but she knew one thing for certain. He had changed everything. The diner slowly came back to life after the bikers left. Customers whispered among themselves, their voices a mix of awe and disbelief. Some stared at Chuck Norris, trying to figure out who he was, while others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid to draw any attention to themselves. The air still felt heavy, as if the tension from Jake Malone's outburst hadn't fully dissipated. Lila stood frozen near the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the tray she had been holding earlier. Her wrist throbbed where Jake had grabbed her. But it wasn't just physical pain that weighed on her. It was the humiliation. She hated feeling powerless, like she couldn't defend herself or stand up for what was right. But tonight, something had shifted. A stranger, a man she didn't even know, had stepped in when no one else would. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to take a deep breath. Joe emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. His face was pale, and his usual scowl had deepened into a frown. "You okay, Lila?" he asked gruffly, glancing toward the door where the bikers had disappeared. I think so," Lila stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked down at her wrist, which was already starting to bruise. He didn't hurt me too bad." Joe sighed heavily, shaking his head. "I should have done something. I should have told them to leave the second they walked in." "It's not your fault," Lila said quickly, though her tone lacked conviction. She glanced over at Chuck, who sat calmly at the counter, sipping his coffee as if nothing unusual had happened. He seemed completely unfazed by the chaos he had just interrupted. Besides, someone did step in. Joe followed her gaze and frowned. "Who is that guy anyway?" "You know him?" "No," Lila admitted. "I've never seen him before tonight." Joe muttered something under his breath about strange coincidences, but didn't press further. Instead, he turned his attention back to the mess left behind by The bikers, the shattered bottles, spilled beer, and overturned chairs. "Clean this up quick," he instructed, "and then take a break. You look like you could use one." Lila nodded absently and began picking up the broken glass. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. She kept replaying the moment Chuck had intervened, the way he had effortlessly disarmed Jake without raising his voice or losing his cool. There was something almost otherworldly about him, like he belonged to a different era, or maybe a different story entirely. As she worked, Chuck finished his coffee and stood up. He dropped a few bills onto the counter and turned to leave. Something inside Lila snapped. Before she could stop herself, she blurted out, "Wait." Chuck paused, turning to face her with a raised eyebrow. "Yes?" I just wanted to say thank you," Lila said, her cheeks flushing red. "For what you did back there. I don't know why you stepped in, but I'm really grateful." Chuck smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "No thanks needed," he replied simply. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect." His words hit Lila harder than she expected. Respect, that was something she rarely received, from people like Jake Malone. Whether it was customers yelling at her for mistakes she hadn't made or professors dismissing her questions in class, she often felt overlooked and undervalued. But hearing Chuck say those words made her realize how much she deserved better, and how much she needed to demand it. "Still," Lila pressed, taking a step closer, "what you did, it meant a lot. Not many people would have done that." Chuck studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a napkin. On it, he scribbled a phone number with a pen he borrowed from the counter. "If you ever need help again," he said, handing it to her, "don't hesitate to call." Lila stared at the napkin, stunned. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," Chuck replied, his tone firm but kind. "The world can be a tough place, especially for people like you. But remember this, you're stronger than you think." Before Lila could respond, Chuck tipped his hat slightly and walked out the door. She watched him go, clutching the napkin tightly in her hand. It wasn't until Joe called her name that she snapped out of her daze. "You comin' or what?" Joe asked, jerking his thumb toward the staff break room. "You earned a breather." Lila nodded numbly and followed him, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the image of Chuck walking away, disappearing into the night like some kind of guardian angel. Who was he? And why had he chosen to intervene tonight of all nights? Meanwhile, miles away from the diner, Jake Malone stormed into his clubhouse, slamming the door so hard it rattled the walls. His gang lounged around the dimly lit room, drinking beer and playing cards. When they saw the look on Jake's face, they fell silent. "What happened to you?" one of them asked, gesturing to the wet stain on Jake's jacket. "That damn waitress ruined my jacket," Jake growled, pacing back and forth. "And then some old guy, some nobody, stepped in and humiliated me in front of everyone. Can you believe that?" The room erupted in laughter. "Some old guy took you down?" Another biker sneered. "Man, you must be losing your touch." Jake stopped pacing and glared at them. "Shut up, it wasn't like that. He caught me off guard, that's all. If I'd had more time, I would have crushed him." "Sure you would have," someone muttered sarcastically, earning a round of snickers. Jake clenched his fists, his face turning red. "Laugh all you want, but this isn't over. That guy embarrassed me, and now he's gonna pay. Same goes for that waitress. Nobody makes a fool out of Jake Malone and gets away with it." The laughter died down as the bikers realized Jake was serious. One of them leaned forward, setting his beer bottle on the table. "So what's the plan?" Jake smirked, his confidence returning. "We wait until tomorrow night. By then, word will have spread about what happened. Everyone in town will know. I got punked by some old geezer. So we march into that diner, make an example out of him and anyone else who thinks they can cross us." The bikers exchanged dark looks, sensing the danger in Jake's plan, but none of them dared argue. They knew better than to question Jake when he was in this kind of mood. Back at the diner, Lila sat in the break room, staring blankly at the wall. The events of the evening replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't turn off. She thought, about Jake's cruel words, the way he had treated her like she was worthless. She thought about Chuck's quiet strength, the way he had stood up for her without hesitation. And most of all, she thought about the napkin in her pocket, the phone number scrawled in neat handwriting. For years, Lila had accepted the idea that life was unfair, that people like her were destined to be pushed around by those with more power. But tonight something inside her had shifted. Maybe it was Chuck's words. Maybe it was the memory of seeing Jake brought to his knees. Whatever it was, Lila felt a spark of defiance burning within her, a determination to fight back against the injustice she faced every day. She pulled the napkin out of her pocket and studied it carefully. The numbers blurred slightly as tears welled up in her eyes, not tears of sadness but of resolve. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't let anyone treat her like dirt ever again. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine roared to life, signaling the start of a storm that was bound to shake Maplewood to its core. The next morning, Maplewood woke up under a blanket of gray clouds. The sky was heavy with the promise of rain, and the streets were quieter than usual. People hurried along the sidewalks, clutching their jackets tightly as a cold breeze swept through the town. At Joe's diner, however, the mood inside was anything but calm. Lila arrived early for her shift, her mind still replaying the events of the previous night. She hadn't slept well, tossing and turning as she thought about Jake Malone's threats and Chuck Norris's unexpected intervention. The napkin with his phone number was safely tucked into her pocket, and she found herself reaching for it every few minutes just to make sure it was still there. It felt like a lifeline, a reminder that she wasn't alone even if she didn't fully understand why Chuck had chosen to step in. Joe greeted her at the door with a worried expression. "You sure you're okay to work today?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. "After what happened last night, I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to take a day off." "I'll be fine," Lila replied, forcing a smile. "Besides, who else is going to clean up after the breakfast rush?" Joe sighed but didn't argue. He knew better than to try changing Lila's mind once she'd made it up. Instead, he handed her an apron and nodded toward the dining area. "Just be careful, all right? If those bikers show up again, I don't want you anywhere near them." Lila nodded, though deep down, she wasn't sure how much control she'd have over the situation. As she tied her apron around her waist, she glanced out the window. The parking lot was empty for now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was lurking just around the corner. Across town, Jake Malone was already stirring up chaos. His gang had gathered at their clubhouse early that morning, fueled by anger and revenge. Jake paced back and forth like a caged animal, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. The stain on his leather jacket served as a constant reminder of his humiliation, and he swore to himself that he wouldn't rest until he made someone pay. "Tonight," Jake announced, slamming his fist against the wall, "we hit that diner again. And this time, we make sure everyone knows not to mess with us." His gang cheered, raising their beer bottles in agreement. They loved nothing more than causing trouble, especially when it came with the promise of violence. One of them, a wiry man named Roy, leaned forward with a wicked grin. "What about that old guy who stepped in last night? What do we do about him?" Jake's eyes narrowed. "Oh, we'll deal with him too. But first, we send a message to that waitress. Let her know what happens when she crosses the wrong people, Riken." Chuckled darkly. "Should be fun." Back at the diner, the morning passed uneventfully. Customers came and went, ordering pancakes, eggs, and coffee without incident. Lila worked hard to keep her focus on her tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to Jake and his gang. Every time the bell above the door rang, she flinched, expecting to see them walk in. By noon, her nerves were frayed, and she could feel a headache building behind her temples. During a rare lull in the lunch rush, Lila decided to take a quick break. She slipped into the staff room and sat down at the small table, resting her head in her hands. The napkin with Chuck's phone number lay on the table in front of her, its presence both comforting and daunting. She picked it up and stared at the numbers, wondering if she should call him. Would he even answer? And if he did, what would she say? Before she could decide, the sound of motorcycles growling in the distance caught her attention. Her heart sank as she realized they were getting closer. She rushed to the window and peeked outside, her worst fears confirmed. Jake and his gang were pulling into the parking lot, their bikes rumbling like thunder. There were more of them this time, easily a dozen men, all dressed in leather and looking ready for a fight. Lila's stomach twisted into knots. She considered calling the police, but she knew it would take too long for them to arrive. Besides, Jake and his gang had ways of avoiding trouble with the law. No, she was on her own. For now. Taking a deep breath, Lila steeled herself and walked back into the dining area. She whispered a quick warning to Joe, who immediately started ushering customers toward the back exit. "Get out while you can," he urged them. "This isn't going to be pretty." By the time Jake and his gang burst through the door, the diner was nearly empty. Only Lila and Joe remained, standing side by side behind the counter. Jake scanned the room with a smug grin, clearly pleased with the fear he saw in their eyes. Well, he sneered, stepping forward. "Looks like the old man isn't here to save you this time." Lila swallowed hard but refused to look away. "What do you want, Jake?" "You know exactly what I want," Jake spat, pointing a finger at her. "An apology. On your knees." Joe stepped in front of Lila protectively. "Leave her alone, Jake. She didn't do anything to you." Jake laughed cruelly. "Oh, I think she did. But don't worry. We'll get to you too, old man." Before anyone could react, the bikers spread out, surrounding the counter. Their movements were deliberate, calculated, designed to intimidate. Lila felt trapped, her pulse racing as she searched for a way out. Just as she began to lose hope, the sound of a car engine pulling into the parking lot broke the tension. Everyone turned to look as a sleek black truck rolled to a stop outside. The driver's door opened, and Chuck Norris stepped out. He wore the same flannel shirt and jeans as the night before, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he strode toward the diner, his boots clicking against the pavement. Jake's grin faltered. "What the hell is he doing here?" Chuck entered the diner, ignoring the bikers completely. He walked straight up to Lila and Joe, his gaze steady. "You two all right?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Lila nodded, relief washing over her. "We're okay, for now." Chuck turned to face Jake, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I thought I told you to leave her alone," Jake bristled, stepping forward. "And I thought I told you to mind your own business, old man." For a moment, no one moved. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, without warning, Jake lunged at Chuck, aiming a punch at his face. It was a reckless move, born of anger and arrogance. And it was exactly what Chuck had been waiting for. With effortless precision, Chuck sidestepped the attack and grabbed Jake's arm, twisting it behind his back. Jake let out a yelp of pain as Chuck spun him around and pinned him to the floor. The other bikers hesitated, unsure of what to do. None of them had ever seen anyone take down Jake so easily. "Listen carefully," Chuck said, his voice low but commanding. "You come near this diner or these people again and you'll regret it. Do I make myself clear?" Jake struggled to break free, but Chuck's grip was ironclad. Finally, he muttered, Yeah, whatever." Chuck released him and stepped back, his posture relaxed but alert. The bikers scrambled to help Jake to his feet, their bravado crumbling under Chuck's unwavering gaze. Within moments, they were retreating out the door, muttering curses under their breath. Once they were gone, the diner fell silent. Lila stared at Chuck, her heart pounding. "How did you—" Chuck shrugged modestly. "Sometimes people need a reminder that bullying doesn't work." Lila didn't know whether to laugh or cry. All she could manage was a shaky, "Thank you." Chuck smiled faintly. "Like I said before, you're stronger than you think. Don't forget that." As he turned to leave, Lila called after him. "Wait, where are you going?" He paused at the door and glanced back. "Wherever I'm needed next." "Take care of, yourself, Lila." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the stormy afternoon as quickly as he had arrived. Lila watched him go, clutching the napkin with his phone number tightly in her hand. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. The days that followed were a blur for Lila Harper. After Chuck Norris's second intervention, Jake Malone and his gang seemed to vanish from Maplewood, at least for the time being. The diner returned to its usual rhythm, with customers trickling in for meals and conversations filling the space once again. But beneath the surface calm, Lila felt like she was living in two worlds. On one hand, life went on as it always had. Orders to take, tables to clean, and dreams of nursing school to chase. On the other hand, something inside her had changed, forever. She couldn't stop thinking about what Chuck had said to her. "You're stronger than you think." Those words echoed in her mind, louder and clearer than any insult Jake had thrown at her. For years, Lila had accepted the idea that she was powerless, that people like Jake Malone would always have the upper hand because they were bigger, louder, or scarier. But now, she wasn't so sure. Chuck had shown her that strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about standing up for yourself and refusing to back down when someone tried to push you around. It started small. At work, Lila began speaking up when customers snapped at her for no reason. Instead of apologizing, profusely and scurrying away, she held her ground, calmly explaining that mistakes happened but rudeness wasn't acceptable. To her surprise, most people backed off quickly, almost as if they hadn't expected her to fight back. Even Joe noticed the change. "You've got a backbone now," he remarked one evening as they closed up the diner. "I like it." Lila smiled, faintly. "I guess I'm tired of letting people walk all over me." Joe nodded approvingly. "Good for you. Just don't forget, you've still got limits. Don't go picking fights you can't win." "I won't," Lila promised, and she meant it. Standing up for herself didn't mean becoming reckless. It meant knowing when to say no and when to ask for help. Meanwhile, Jake Malone was far from done causing trouble. Though his gang had retreated after their humiliating defeat at the diner, they weren't about to let things slide. Word of Chuck Norris's involvement spread quickly through the biker community, sparking both fear and outrage. Some bikers joked that Jake had been taken down by a legend, while others whispered warnings about crossing someone who could disarm an entire gang without breaking a sweat. Still, Jake refused to back down. "He's just one guy," Jake muttered to Roy during a late-night meeting at the clubhouse. "One guy can't be everywhere at once." Roy raised an eyebrow. "You really want to test that theory? After what happened last time?" Jake slammed his fist against the table. "I'm not running scared because some old dude decided to play hero. We need to teach him and that waitress a lesson they won't forget." "But how?" Another biker chimed in. "We storm the diner again and we'll look like fools." Jake leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Then a slow, sinister smile spread across his face. "Maybe we don't hit the diner directly. Maybe we hit closer to home." Lila didn't realize she was being watched until it was almost too late. One evening, as she walked home from her shift at the diner, she noticed a figure lingering near the corner of her apartment building. At first, she thought it might be a neighbor or someone waiting for a ride, but something about the person's posture made her uneasy. She quickened her pace, clutching her keys tightly in her hand. As she reached the door to her building, the figure stepped into the light. It was Roy, one of Jake's gang members. He smirked at her, his hands shoved into the pockets of his leather jacket. "Evenin', sweetheart," he drawled. "Fancy seeing you here." Lila's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want?" "Just having a little chat," Roy replied, taking a step closer. "Jake sent me to deliver a message. He says you've been causing problems lately, talking back, acting tough. That's not very smart, is it?" "I haven't caused any problems," Lila shot back, her voice trembling slightly. "I've just been doing my job." Roy chuckled darkly. "Well, maybe you should think twice about stirring up trouble. People like Jake don't forget easily." Before Leela could respond, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Both Lila and Roy turned to see Chuck Norris standing a few feet away, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. His sudden appearance was so unexpected that Roy actually stumbled backward, his confidence faltering. No problem, Roy stammered, glancing between Lila and Chuck. Just talking. Chuck took a step forward, his gaze locking onto Roy's. Funny way of talking. Why don't you head home before this gets messy? For a moment, Roy looked like he might argue, but then he muttered something under his breath, gave Lila one last glare and disappeared into the shadows. Once he was gone, Chuck turned to Lila. You okay? Lila nodded, though her legs felt weak. Yeah, thanks to you. Chuck frowned. This keeps happening, you should report them. I know, Lila admitted. But what if they come after me again? What if they hurt someone else? They will, Chuck said bluntly. Unless you stop them now. His words struck a chord deep within Lila. She realized that staying silent wouldn't protect her, or anyone else. If she wanted to make a real difference, she had to take action. The next morning, she visited the local police station and filed a formal complaint against Jake Malone and his gang. She included every detail she could remember, from the harassment at the diner to Roy's threatening behavior outside her apartment. The officers listened carefully, their expressions growing increasingly serious as she spoke. We've heard rumors about these guys, one of them said, but we've never had enough evidence to act. Your statement could help us build a case. Lila left the station feeling drained but hopeful. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she was fighting back, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied or intimidated into silence. Over the next few weeks, the pressure mounted. Jake and his gang grew more desperate, resorting to petty vandalism and threats in an effort to scare Lila into dropping her complaint. They slashed her car tires, left ominous notes on her doorstep, and even tried to intimidate her classmates at the community college. But Lila refused to give in. With each new attack, she reported it to the police, adding to the growing pile of evidence against them. Word of her bravery spread throughout Maplewood. Neighbors who had once avoided getting involved began offering their support, sharing their own stories of run-ins with Jake and his gang. Slowly but surely, the town rallied behind her, united by a shared desire to see justice served. Then came the breakthrough. Acting on a tip from an anonymous informant, the police raided the bikers' clubhouse, uncovering a stash of illegal weapons and drugs hidden beneath the floorboards. Jake and several of his gang members were arrested on charges of drug trafficking, extortion, and assault. As the news broke, the entire town erupted in celebration. Lila watched the headlines unfold from the safety of her apartment, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't just relief she felt, it was pride. Pride in herself for standing up, pride in her community for coming together, and pride in knowing that she had made a difference. Later that evening, she pulled out the napkin with Chuck's phone number and stared at it for a long time. She had never called him, partly because she didn't want to impose and partly because she wasn't sure what to say. But now she knew exactly what she wanted to tell him. Picking up her phone, she dialed the number. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. Hello? Hi, Mr. Norris, Lila said, her voice shaking slightly. It's Lila Harper, from the diner. There was a pause, and then Chuck chuckled softly. Lila, how are you holding up? I'm good, she replied, smiling despite herself. Better than good, actually. Thanks to you. You did the hard part, Chuck said kindly. Standing up takes courage. Remember that. I will, Lila promised, and thank you for everything. You're welcome, Chuck replied. Take care of yourself, all right? I will, Lila said, her voice steadier now. Thank you again. After hanging up, she sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of everything sink in. The fight wasn't completely over. There would still be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Lila felt ready to face them head-on. Months passed and Maplewood began to feel like a different town. The arrest of Jake Malone and his gang marked the end of an era for the small community. For years, they had been a shadow looming over the town, a constant reminder that fear could silence even the strongest voices. But now, with their clubhouse shut down and their members locked away in prison, the people of Maplewood started to breathe easier. It wasn't just about safety, it was about hope. Hope that standing up to bullies could make a difference, and that justice, though slow, was possible. Lila Harper noticed the change most of all. At Joe's diner, customers joked and laughed without glancing nervously at the door every time it opened. Strangers greeted her warmly, often thanking her for having the courage to speak out against Jake and his gang. Some even called her a hero, though Lila always brushed off the praise. "I'm not a hero," she would say with a shy smile. "I just did what anyone should have done." But deep down, she knew something had shifted, not just in the town, but within herself. The girl who once avoided conflict at all costs was gone, replaced by someone stronger, braver, and more determined than ever before. She still worked long hours at the diner, balancing shifts with her nursing classes, but she carried herself differently now. Her shoulders were straighter, her voice steadier, and her resolve unshakable. Even Joe had stopped scowling as much, proud of the woman Lila had become. One evening, as Lila closed up the diner, she found herself thinking about Chuck Norris again. She hadn't seen him since that night outside her apartment building, but his presence lingered in her mind like a quiet guardian angel. She often wondered where he was now, and whether he realized how much his actions had changed her life. Without him stepping in when he did, she might never have found the strength to stand up to Jake or file that first complaint. He had planted a seed of confidence in her heart, and it had grown into something extraordinary. As she locked the diner's front door and turned off the lights, she glanced at the napkin tucked safely inside her apron pocket. The phone number written on it had faded slightly from being handled so many times, but its significance remained as powerful as ever. Lila didn't need to call Chuck anymore. She already knew what he would tell her if she did. Keep going. You're stronger than you think. The trial of Jake Malone and his gang became the talk of the town. It dragged on for weeks, with lawyers arguing back and forth and witnesses recounting harrowing tales of intimidation and violence. Lila testified, on the third day, her hands trembling as she took the stand. The courtroom was packed, filled with curious townsfolk eager to see justice served. As she recounted the events at the diner and the threats made outside her home, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes watching her. But instead of shrinking under their gaze, she held her head high. When the prosecutor asked her why she had decided to come forward, Lila paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because I realized I had a choice," she said finally, her voice clear and steady. "I could let them keep hurting me or I could fight back, and I chose to fight." Her testimony brought tears to some spectators' eyes and nods of approval from others. When she stepped down from the stand, several people approached her to offer words of encouragement. "You're amazing," one woman whispered. "Thank you for doing this." By the time the jury delivered their verdict, the entire town seemed to be holding its breath, guilty on all counts. Cheers erupted in the courtroom, and Lila felt a wave of relief wash over her. Justice had been served, not just for her but for everyone who had suffered because of Jake and his gang. After the trial, life in Maplewood settled into a new rhythm. The scars left behind by Jake's reign of terror wouldn't fade overnight, but the town was healing. People began rebuilding trust, reaching out to neighbors they had once avoided out of fear. Joe's diner saw an uptick in business as locals gathered to celebrate their newfound freedom. Lila threw herself into her studies, determined to finish nursing school and give back to the community that had supported her. One crisp autumn morning, as Lila walked to class, she spotted a familiar figure sitting on a park bench near campus. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, his gray hair catching the sunlight. For a moment she thought she was imagining things, but then he looked up and smiled. It was Chuck Norris. "Lila," he said, rising to his feet. "Fancy meeting you here." Lila blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Mr. Norris, what are you doing here? Chuck shrugged modestly. Just passing through. Thought I'd check in and see how you were doing. I'm good, Lila stammered, still trying to process his sudden appearance. Better than good, actually. Thanks to you. Chuck waved a hand dismissively. You did the hard work. I just gave you a little push. A little push? Lila echoed, laughing despite herself. You saved me twice, and probably saved the whole town while you were at it. Chuck chuckled softly. Let's just say I've been around long enough to know when someone needs a helping hand. Besides, I could tell you had it in you all along. They sat together on the bench for a while, talking about everything that had happened since their last meeting. Lila told him about the trial, her nursing classes, and her plans for the future. Chuck listened intently, nodding occasionally and offering words of advice when needed. Eventually, the conversation turned to him. So where are you headed next? Lila asked curiously. Do you ever stay in one place for long? Chuck smiled faintly. Not really. There's always somewhere else to go, someone else who might need help. But I'm glad I stopped here. Lila felt a lump rise in her throat. I don't know how to thank you. You've done so much for me, for all of us. You already thanked me, Chuck replied gently, by finding your strength and using it to make things better. That's all the thanks I need. Before she could respond, he stood up and tipped his hat slightly. Take care of yourself, Lila. And remember, you're stronger than you think. With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd as effortlessly as he had arrived. Lila watched him go, clutching the napkin with his phone number tightly in her hand. She didn't know if she would ever see him again, but she didn't need to. His impact on her life was permanent, etched into her heart like a guiding light. Years later, Lila graduated at the top of her class and became a nurse at Maplewood General Hospital. Her patients admired her compassion and determination, qualities she credited to the lessons she had learned during those difficult months. On her graduation day, she pulled out the napkin one last time and placed it in a scrapbook alongside photos of her family, friends, and mentors. It was a reminder of where she had come from and how far she had come. Though Chuck Norris remained a quiet legend in Maplewood, his story inspired countless others to stand up for what was right. And whenever someone doubted their ability to make a difference, Lila would smile knowingly and say, You're stronger than you think. Because sometimes all it takes is one person, a stranger, a friend, or even a legend, to remind you of your own power.